The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today for today's webinar, Rehiring Your Workforce. We're all really excited to have you with us and to discuss this topic. For those of you who are not familiar with Insala, we focus on talent development software and enabling our clients to build their talent development programs to their full potential. We offer numerous software and consulting options to help enhance talent development needs. If you'd like any more information on this, please visit our website. I'd just like to go over some housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded, and everyone who has registered, if you attend today or not, will receive an email with a recording of the session. You'll get this through later on today. All participants are muted, but we encourage you to participate, and if you have any questions, please use the chat box feature. We'll have a member of staff on standby to answer any questions that you may have throughout the webinar. We'll also have some time at the end of the session for any questions and discuss these with the panel. If you do have any questions, please ask these throughout and do not wait to the end. We'll cover these all at the end of the session. Okay, your speakers today. My name is Steph Halliday and I'm a Sales Operations Assistant based in our London office. I've been with Insala since 2017 and I work with our sales and marketing departments. Really excited to be part of the discussion today. We have some great information to cover. I'm just going to ask each of our speakers to give us a brief introduction. Jeff, could you get us started, please?
Sure. Hello, everyone. This is Jeff Townsend. I have decades of experience within HR and talent management, primarily in the aviation industry and healthcare. And I'm very happy to be here to talk about how to rehire your workforce during this difficult time and how we're going to get through that.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Nick, could you go through your introduction?
Thanks, Steph. So my name's Nick Jones, and I also work in Insala's London office, and I'm a technologist at heart. And I work with companies on a day-to-day basis to help them engage their talent communities and their communities of corporate citizens. I've got extensive background in public sector recruitment, particularly within healthcare. And I'm really excited to share some of these insights with you, particularly on rehiring your workforce and bringing some of those thoughts and ideas forwards for you.
Lovely, thanks, Nick. And finally, Tom.
Yeah, hello, I'm Tom McEwen. I'm the CEO of Trend Data. We're a leading people analytics, predictive people analytics software solution provider. I'm also a columnist with Forbes as a member of their technology council. I've been in software and HR software over 20 years now.
Great, thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone, for those great introductions. We just want to remind everybody of our agenda today. We'll begin with transitioning your workforce, and then moving on to engaging your redundant and furloughed employees, and then finishing up with how best to rehire your workforce. As you can see on the current slide, we have some pretty dramatic figures, which gives an insight into the current state of the jobs market. In France, these figures equate to nearly half of the private sector workforce and 6% of the workforce in Australia. The good news is that we have been in a pretty big recession before and come out the other end. Does any of the panel have anything to add?
Well, usually when an economic downturn is dictated by non-economic events, such as a health crisis, the recovery does often tend to be quicker on the comeback, but it all depends, of course, on the length of the crisis.
Absolutely, thanks for that, Tom.
Yeah, and I think what's taken people by surprise is certainly the speed at which the jobless figures have racked up, certainly in the States. I think it's 15% unemployment, which is levels not seen since the Great Depression, really within a couple of months. So it really hasn't left HR leaders and strategists much time to plan for anything. So there's been a lot of I suppose that's added a lot to the confusion around continued operations, but certainly for HR professionals, they're at their busiest points at the moment, struggling with contingency planning, and it's really just a very, very tricky situation. I think the difference is that with the great financial crash we had, perhaps the whole economic model had to be revisited and really built up with the collapse of certain financial institutions, where there is hope, as Tom mentions, with this more of a V-shaped recovery where we will start to see things bouncing back much quicker, in mirroring in the opposite direction the precipitous crash that we've had in jobs numbers and business applying in for furlough in the UK, which we've seen about 140,000, which is a striking number. So there's good and bad elements there, but certainly a very dynamic context and a very tricky context for HR professionals to plan through.
Absolutely, thanks Nick. Only time will tell how this will pan out. Moving on to the next slide, we have a poll that we are going to be going through. So the question is, has your organisation furloughed or laid off employees? We have yes, we've done both. Yes, we have only furloughed employees. Yes, we have only laid off employees. No, we have not. Or no, we are currently hiring. If you just go to the polls feature in the tab, you can answer accordingly. Great, looks like we have quite a mixed bag there. So we have a split on the top three responses. We don't have anyone currently hiring at the moment, which we can kind of assume this is going to be the same for a lot of people at the moment. Let's move on to first item on our agenda. Looking at transitioning your workforce and providing support to these employees. Jeff, could you take us through the next slide, please?
Sure, thank you. One of the things we need to think about as we consider rehiring employees once the recovery begins to happen, we need to think about how are they exiting the organization in the first place. So here's a quick list of do's and don'ts. This is from the Harvard Business Review, actually. There's an article called How to Tell Someone They're Being Laid Off, in case you want to look at that. I'm not going to go through each of these points here, but I do want to talk about a few things behind them. One of the things we need to consider as you transition employees out of the organization is to be sure to treat everyone with dignity. And think about that, because employees and customers are watching. They're watching what you're doing, and they're watching to see if your words and actions are reflective of your organization's mission and values. So you want to make sure that those are reflected. Also practice before you have these conversations. Don't go in cold. And you may want to have an HR person with you in the room, and I think it's probably a good idea, who can take over the conversation a little bit later, and anticipate the worst case scenarios. You're likely to see some crying or some emotional aspects of the conversation show up pretty quickly, and people will be thinking about the hardship that it's causing them. So have a script, be ready and prepared, but don't sound scripted. You need to strike the right balance in that conversation. And something to consider are logistics. I know this is a really trying time for some people to get together to have these conversations, but it's really important to ensure privacy for that employee to have this conversation and be able to ask some questions of you directly. A quick all hands webinar or conference call is really not going to serve the employee or the organization well. And in these times, if a webinar or conference call is your only option, I'd say be sure to plan individual follow-up calls or meetings so that you can have that one-on-one time and they can express their concerns and you can answer their questions. Be direct, get to the point quickly and be honest, and have documents ready for them. I think that shows real respect that those documents are ready and that they include information on benefits, severance, last pay date. And it's really important to plan for career transition services. That's another sign of respect, and it will help the employee land on his or her feet. And I mentioned having an HR rep there with you. I think that's important because the HR rep can then go over the documentation and transition services with the employee. Of course, if you have an outplacement firm, they may be able to provide a representative to do that as well. And of course, and last but not least, be compassionate. If these are high potential employees, or if you have really strong relationships, make sure you offer to make contacts for them and provide great personal references. In general, that's it. Individualize this. The large calls probably won't serve you well, and be prepared. So I think when you talk about, yes, transition services, some things to think about would be to think about these employees are potentially new customers, or they're at least going to be telling stories about how they experienced your organization, especially during this difficult time. They can become your brand advocates, even if they are no longer with you. You know, based on their experiences, if it was a good experience, they're going to be an advocate for you. And they're also able to refer future talent to the organization as needs arise. If it's not them themselves returning, as we'll talk about later, they will know people who have the skill sets, and you'll want them to refer employees or future talent to you.
Great, thanks, Jeff. I think it's important as well for your transition employees to know that they can trust you. And even though they are transitioning, you're still there to support them in any way that you can. And the ultimate goal is to bring them back into the company and rehire them. Okay, this brings us on to our next item on the agenda, maintaining employee engagement with redundant employees. Nick, could you take us through this slide, please?
Absolutely, thank you, Steph. Just to set the scene here, we're talking about creating community featuring both redundant and remaining employees at the point where, for whatever reason, we've obviously had different degrees of separation enforced by social distancing. And then, of course, if you're furloughing workers or making them redundant, you're going to have additional degrees of separation where you want to stay engaged with people, but there are sort of barriers to be overcome. And of course, the overwhelming one at the moment, which I'm sort of personally struggling with, is working from home, being away from the office, not having that sort of in-person contact. I think it makes it very difficult to stay as engaged as you were before, even if you are, a full-time employee. You're sort of joining company calls. There are interactions that can't be filled by sort of simulated or virtual conversations. So it's important to not underestimate the amount of separation that employees and redundant employees and also furloughed employees are going to be going through at the moment. And that is a real barrier to creating an engaged community. But that said, you'll find that most workers will actually want to create a community and come together with others, have that shared experience of working for your organization. So whether you like it or not, people will be forming groups at grassroots levels and building that perhaps offline, perhaps over WhatsApp groups or LinkedIn, or sharing experiences on Glassdoor. Employees will talk to each other, and it's important to be able to capture that and support it. And indeed, the best companies facilitate it, because the best companies realize that if you build a community and you offer that as a service to everybody, it makes people feel valued, and it makes people much more likely to, as we discussed in the previous slide, to return to the organization at a later date and really focus on the positives of their employment if they come to a point where they're no longer employed, whether they've taken a different route or whether they've been furloughed or, in the worst case, made redundant. It maximizes that positivity and allows you to continue to engage. So what we're really talking about is having a more formal way of engaging, and these are some best practices that we have to formally engage a community and to create that sense of community, but also to ensure that it's working best for you as an organization. And we have sketched out a few different areas here. So you want to create an open line of honest communication, and that's very important. And I think one thing that strikes me here from my sort of experiences are you need executive buy-in to be able to really project the employer brand and your visions and values. It really has to be crystallized at the top. So if it makes it very difficult as a HR leader if you don't have buy-in from your executive team on the common strategy and how you're going to communicate with people. So as part of a planning rule, that's really what you have to do. You have to start at the top, be able to get that overall buy-in there. So CEOs need to really set the tone. You also want to use as many channels as possible. So a couple of examples I have of working with a large company, a large financial services company that have managed to very successfully engage all of their employees using a chain of podcasts with their chief executive providing messages and interviews. And it's not obviously a one-to-one communication, but they are tailored to speak to the individual, and they are pitched at that of the individual. So understanding employees and using and tailoring your communications to reflect that, it can be a very, very impactful way of connecting and nurturing a community at this time. That's very important. And using different channels. I mean, have you thought about potentially writing or sending letters to your community? Is there a newsletter that could be circulated? Webinars and workshops are obviously very valid at the moment as well. So don't just think about one channel or rely on one channel, but think about joining them all together. And the next point that we've got down here is lead with empathy, patience, and transparency. And I think this does speak a little bit to honest communication as well, because the people who are engaging in these communities and are the ringleaders, I say ringleaders in a negative way, but really your alumni champions are going to be more engaged. They're potentially high potential alumni who care about their experience at the company. They care more about their career. They're likely to go further in their career. They potentially have more emotional intelligence because rather than just checking out as soon as they've left or been made redundant, they want to stay in touch with people. They want to still they still care about the organization, the brand, its community. So you have to adopt a style that really speaks to them, and they're looking for an authentic experience and method of communication. So you really cannot underestimate and underemphasize the importance of that point, having transparency and empathy and patience. And obviously this is particularly important if you are in the secondary stage of where you may have had layoffs or redundancies or furloughs. There may be people may be coming back at a later point. They need to stay updated about their evolving employee status. So there are examples of some organizations I know that have a weekly call with furloughed employees just to ensure that they have the latest information about their role. And they're also offered a chance to speak directly to the HR representative at that point as well. So there are ways of keeping people engaged very directly. But again, you are mirroring the type of engagement to the audience, and you're building it around what that particular person needs. So there are a few of my thoughts there. Obviously, with my role, I do work quite a lot with career development and talent development technology. So I'm able to see firsthand the positive effects that can have. But employee engagement standpoint, it's really one of the most effective methods that you can have. Not only do you create a more effective employee by perhaps getting them together in a mentoring relationship, or by having them develop to the next career level without having to bring in an external hire at great cost. But you do engage and make the employees think that you care about them as a person. As an individual, as somebody that counts. And one strategy that I'll share from that is, as a best practice, I thought was great really, is having an employee plan. As soon as somebody starts at your organization, mapping out an employee plan that is really something that lives with them for the duration of their employment with that organization. And it can be updated, it can be taken forwards and modified. But it does allow an employee to feel that they're being valued and also take ownership of their development in that respect. So career development as part of that can be very important. The other areas of that I'd mention quickly there are career development and offering, for example, mentoring or coaching, and networking, which can be extremely important for finding your next job. Does have other benefits to the other points we're talking about here about creating that two-way conversation between you and your alumni community, because it does allow increased awareness and alignment between employees and the organizations themselves, because you're able to see exactly what career development an employee wants. So you can start picking out individual themes from that particular development point. And then as a HR professional, you can really log that and against what else you've seen across a certain cohort or a department. And it really helps build your alignment between your employee's journey and your organizational journey, because they need to be in sync. So there are a few I had, a few best practices, but as a headline, these points are certainly extremely valid, and there's a lot you can do at this point. So there are a lot of new best practices and new strategies and engagement techniques, despite the issues we're having and the initial difficulty of us not being in the same room and other forms of communication going out the window. So there's a lot to do in terms of best practices.
Absolutely, thank you, Nick. I love the idea of creating the community with the redundant and the remaining employees, because ultimately you want to bring them back in and they will be an employee once again, and you don't want to keep these separate.
Well, exactly, yeah. You want to keep people engaged for life and not discount their value, future value to you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
definitely. Thanks, Nick. This takes us on to our final point of the agenda, rehiring your workforce and bringing back your most valuable asset. Tom, could you walk us through this first slide, please?
Yeah, well, this kind of tags on to what was said in the prior two sessions. First of all, you want to be respectful and not cut ties with your redundant employees, particularly if they are high-performing employees. And even if they're employees you don't intend on bringing back, the way you handle things like this is what really elevates your brand in the community. I don't know if many of you have petitioned or been contacted by Fortune or one of the organizations that do the best places to work for and most admired companies. How you handle layoffs is actually a very big point with them. So treating your ex-employees with respect is very key. As we talked a little about the online community as what you can do with your former workers, particularly if the interest is in eventually bringing them back, forming an online community serves many purposes. One is it does keep your employees engaged, and that's beneficial from both an employer and an employee standpoint. From the employer standpoint is you're letting them know what's going on, and perhaps if it's close to a rehire situation, they can start getting ready. And even if it's further off, gives employees something to do, and also helps them maintain a sense of connection in the down times. You can share things like company progress, how the company's doing financially, getting back on its feet in the market, which generally leads to areas of being able to rehire. And also, if you're constantly in touch with them, you don't want to be on an even keel with your competitors when it gets to the point to rehire them. You want to have the first stab at bringing employees back, and a community is good for that. And again, also shows that you're caring. They're not just numbers on a spreadsheet. Your employees are people, and you want to make sure that they're treated like that. Another area of importance is, if the plan is to eventually bring all or some of the furloughed or laid off employees back, is to keep them involved in your workforce plan. I'm sure most of you do, companies do actually do workforce planning with their current employees, where people work, who are the high performers, tenure, compensation and everything, it's very well serving to be able to do this with your ex-employees as well. Because if you look, as you're moving forward, the ability to know what each of these people did, how proficient they were at their job, should be in something that you're projecting out in your people analytics or whatever solution as to who you want to bring back, when you want to bring them back, and where you're going to fit them in as an overall evolving and dynamic plan. And again, as what I mentioned earlier, it's something that your competitors are waiting for the market to turn around just like you, and they'll snap up your people and exploit what you've been doing as a company if you don't treat them with respect. Move to the next slide.
Yep, thanks, Tom.
Sure. So the benefits of rehiring ex-employees as opposed to hiring, fresh new employees is, first of all, the employee is familiar with the job and you're familiar with them. I've hired, I don't know, hundreds of people over my career, and I don't always get it right. Someone can look great on paper, they can do a great interview, and then they get on the job and suddenly there's a different person there than what you saw. When that's a person who's already been with the company, already been around, you've already seen them, they've already done the job, that's a much surer bet than bringing in someone you haven't seen before. There's also a much more limited recruiting effort if you do some of the things we've talked about prior, such as keeping a community, keeping in touch with your employees. You have the spot open, someone who worked for you before, you can snap them right back into the organization, not have to go through all the cost of putting it out on a job board or hiring recruiters. You can bring those people right back in. As I said, they've already done the job, they can plug right in. You don't have to onboard or train them unless a long enough time has gone by where the job may have changed a little bit. There might be some additional training or onboarding. But if it's a V-shaped recovery where things went down quick and then things come back quick, hopefully that's the case here. Chances are you can bring those people right back, plug them into their current job, and you're not spending any additional money in training and onboarding. And a big key, particularly in the white-collar sector, is time to productivity. Bringing back a former employee that hasn't been gone too long is generally, as well as being able to fill the job, productive much faster than bringing somebody new on. Even I think most of you experienced, if you've recruited and brought someone in, even if they're in the industry, coming from a competitor, doing what you think is the exact same job, there still is a ramp to when those people are going to be productive and contributing to the company. I asterisked a little figure down here. There's a periodical called Training Industry Quarterly, which actually cites across multiple industries that among white-collar employees, it often is 1 to 2 years before that employee is as fully productive as your existing employees. So that's a lot of training, that's a lot of uptime, and that's a lot of investment by the company. So big benefit to be able to bring someone in who can already do that job. There's been other surveys that are a little less than that, but this one was pretty striking, and it was a pretty lengthy article, and it actually broke it down by different industries. So if anybody wants to request a link to that article, we'd be happy to provide that. So those kind of the highlights. I think they're self-evident of rehiring people.
Great, thank you, Tom. Some great points there to round off our conversation and utilising your most valuable asset, your employees. We're approaching the end of our time today. If you do have any questions, please submit these in the questions box now. I'm going to pass over to Katie, who will run through some of the questions that we've already received.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Mouton, and I run the marketing department at Insala. We do have one question that I see so far. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free. I have my chat box open, so I'll see those coming in. So our question is, do you think it's better to take a group or individual approach when trying to engage your redundant employees?
Well, my experience has been, if you can do individually, that's a much better way to do it. But sometimes depending on the size of the situation, that may not be possible. But as as small as possible as you can keep it is the better. The more individual attention you can give to questions and the one-on-one, or at least the dedicated answers to people is preferable. But yeah, you gotta go with what the situation allows you.
Yeah, Tom, I think that's good information. I would agree. It's kind of a mix depending on the organization and the teams. I've seen where some teams are having calls where it's up to maybe 5 people if it's a small team. And then there's larger conference calls for maybe the leadership team. And then individual calls to check in on individual team members. So it's definitely a mix. And I'd say you'll have to just figure that out by trying 1 or 2 different methods.
Yeah, I just add to that. It sort of goes back to the using many different ways of communicating with your audience and your employees, because there'll be preferences within that, whether people want to how people want to assimilate that information. Obviously, one-to-one communication for the more sensitive conversations feels like a must, but having a mix of group communications and networking, and also individual communication, which does try to attempt to communicate with the individual a little bit more directly, preferable. So you really want to try and diversify the amount of communications you make as far as possible.
Okay, we do have one more question. Let's see. They said that there are times when they encounter an employee who's very upset about being furloughed or being laid off. Would you invite those people to be part of the community and receive the information that everyone else is getting, or would you not consider rehiring them?
Well, it kind of depends on, how, if you're upset, I can't believe this has happened. If I guess the employee, is volatile and becomes toxic, there's, differing scenarios, but you have to anticipate that, the majority of people are not going to be happy to get this kind of news. So as compassionate and empathetic as you can be, but, you do have to, decide on, what, how volatile and, what can have with the employee, and that would enter, of course, into your decision as to, whether they'd be a good hire to come back.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Tom. That's all the questions that I see, Stephanie.
Great, thanks, Katie, and thanks for that. That wraps up the conversation nicely. Do any of our panel have anything else they'd like to say before we do wrap up?
I do want to mention that we have another webinar that we're having on Thursday. We're going to talk about how to enhance your client relationships to continue to generate revenue during these difficult times. I'll be sending everyone an email out with the recording of this webinar, and there will be a link to that new webinar that's happening in 2 days in that email. So if you'd like to join us, we'd love to have you there.
Brilliant, thanks, Katie. On the current screen, we've currently got everyone's contact details. Please do get in touch if you have any questions. We'd love to hear from you. I'd like to thank our panel for a great discussion on rehiring your workforce today, and thank you all for joining us. Stay safe and have a lovely day all.